This is Steve Zeltzer with United Public Workers for Action, and we're here today to commemorate the 1919 Seattle General Strike and also to talk about the struggle today for general strike in the United States and for mobilization of the working class against the attacks that they face. 100 years ago, a general strike took place in Seattle. Today in 2019, the talk about general strike is being raised as a means to stop Trump's attack on public workers and also to defend the entire working class. CWA-AFA President Sara in a commemoration of MLK called for the organization of the general strike to defend public workers and also carried out the agenda of Martin Luther King. The Seattle general strike was called by shipyard workers. The last general strike was in 1946 when a transit streetcar worker who was a member of ATU 192 shut down his streetcar in solidarity with clerical workers, department store workers who were striking and were picketing the department store. This was supported by 100,000 workers who were members of the AFL union. It was called off after 3 days by the president of the AFL without a contract for the clerical workers who failed in their effort to unionize. It also came on the heels of the successful 1934 Longshore and West Coast Maritime strike. West Coast dockers who were members of the ILA organized a strike for union hiring hall and shut down the docks. The union contained communists, syndicalists, and militants, and they had built a democratic structure that was able to withstand the Pacific Maritime Association and the government pressure, as well as the corrupt leadership of the ILA under Joe Ryan, which was virtually a company union. After the murder of 3 strike participants in front of the ILA headquarters on Stewart Street in San Francisco, the San Francisco Labor Council voted to support a general strike which shut down the city. The strike ended when the unions forced the government to accept binding arbitration, which led to an agreement for the hiring hall, which still exists today. And one of the reasons that the ILW is as strong as it is because of their coast-wide contract and a union hiring hall. They control the work. At the time, Franklin Roosevelt and the capitalists were growing worried that this mass movement of the working class would really threaten their power. So the San Francisco Labor Council voted to support a general strike which shut down the city. The strike ended when the unions forced the government to accept binding arbitration, which led to an agreement for the hiring hall. At the time, Franklin Roosevelt and the capitalists were growing worried that this mass movement of the working class would really threaten their power. The Minneapolis Teamster strike, also in 1934, had also successfully defeated the bosses in the National Guard with mass street battles. This strike was led by militants who were part of the Communist League of America, the first Trotskyist group in the United States. The radical history of the American working class, of course, has been hidden by the corporate media and a pro-capitalist trade union bureaucracy that wants labor management partnerships and a quote-unquote seat at the table with the bosses. During the general strikes, sit-downs, and occupations during the 1930s, the growth of the left, the Communist Party, had at its height over 100,000 members. The Depression also created a split in the U.S. trade unions that led to a fistfight on the floor of the American Federation of Labor Convention between AFL President Bill Green and John L. Lewis of the United Mine Workers. The fight in part was over the organization of industrial workers in the United States. The AFL was a craft union whose leadership did not want to organize industrial workers in one union. The fight in the AFL led to the formation of the Congress of Industrial Unions, CIO, which was supported by John L. Lewis of the mine workers and other unions that want to build unions in steel, auto, and rubber. It was also a new federation that in most cases included not just white workers but African American workers. The CIO was an integrated union federation, which was a big break from the AFL. It funded organizers throughout the country and supported the organization in auto, longshore, steel, and rubber in thousands of plants. John L. Lewis, though, although he was a Republican, had no problem hiring communists and socialists to become organizers, and many of the real organizers of the CIO were socialists, communists, and leftists of all stripes. The mass strike wave that took place shook U.S. capitalism to its core. While the capitalist press reeled about the Red Revolution during this period, the actual demands of the working class were for unionization, social protections, and against the total political control of the capitalist class. The rise of Roosevelt was a reflection of the fear of one section of the capitalist class that they had to make concessions and reforms of the system if they did not want the crisis to spin out of control and lead to a revolutionary development in the working class. As a result of these successful worker rebellions and strikes, concessions were wrung out of the capitalist class, including Social Security and other reforms of capitalism. The ideology of the general strikes, workers' power, and internationalism was not new in the U.S. In 1877, during the first National Railway strike, in which Eugene Debs was a striker, refugees from the First International in Germany, the Paris Commune in 1871, joined railroad workers, African Americans, and Native Americans in St. Louis to set up a commune for 3 days. It was crushed when the Missouri senators, who also owned stock in the railroads, urged President Garfield to send in the Army, U.S. Army, to contain the rebellion. The troops were removed from the South and were then used against Native Americans and the rising U.S. working class. During the Civil War, African Americans had rebelled against slave labor and joined the Union Army, helping to defeat the Confederacy. In 1886, anarchists and syndicalists led the fight with mostly immigrants for the 8-hour day, which led to a bombing and the hanging of some of the leaders who were framed up. This did not stop the mobilization of workers in the United States. In 1892, there was a general strike in New Orleans of African American and white workers, which was successful in winning important gains for the working class. That general strike in New Orleans is not well known in the United States, but it was an integrated strike of workers in the South. The International Workers of the World, IWW, was formed by U.S. workers in 1905 to organize a working class uniting all workers regardless of race and sex. It also supported the idea of a general strike. Many of the leaders of the IWW, such as William D. Big Bill Haywood, James Conley, Daniel De Leon, Eugene Debs, Thomas Haggerty, Lucy Parsons, and Mary Higgins, Mother Jones, Frank Bone, William Troutman, Vincent St. John, and Ralph Chaplin. The idea of a general strike had a strong resonance of radical workers in the U.S., but of course it was a threat to the AFL and the present-day AFL-CIO bureaucracy. The depression of the U.S. only came to an end after the Second World War. After the Second World War, which united both the AFL and the CIO in favor of the war, they agreed to end all strikes in the United States. When miners went on strike during the war, the Communist Party said they were scabs. And when Roosevelt, even before the war, broke the North American aviation strike in 1941 using executive orders and U.S. troops, this was supported by the trade union bureaucracy. This was in June before the outbreak of the war, and the CIO leadership opposed the war. After the war, let me just wait. After the war, an anti-communist purge took place in the United States, in which the AFL-CIO was formed. The AFL and the CIO joined together on the basis of labor management collaboration, and also a purge of communists in the unions, communists and leftists. They destroyed left unions like the United Electrical Workers, and they formed a corporate leadership which is pro-capitalist, pro-imperialist, and supports U.S. imperialism. Today, they work with the CIA to set up fake unions in Turkish, fake unions in France, or right-wing unions in France and around the world. So this trade union bureaucracy that we have today is thoroughly pro-capitalist, and they support the Democrats who have been attacking the unions, supporting privatization and other attacks on the workers. However, it is under crisis, and the crisis we're talking about today is a crisis of capitalism, which is driving down the conditions of the working class and is forcing, again, the question of workers' power and workers' action. The 1919 Seattle strike ended after 6 days on February 11, 1919. But the workers in Seattle had also played an important role in supporting the Russian Revolution. They actually stopped, longshoremen actually stopped guns that were heading off from Vladivostok for the U.S. invasion to overthrow the Russian Revolution and support the White Guard in Russia. So this internationalism of the longshoremen in Seattle is a very important part of American working class history, that workers saw that their enemies were not the Russians, the Russian workers, but the capitalist class here. So we have today to learn the lessons of the Seattle strike, because there are going to be other general strikes. We have a President Trump who is agitating, who's provoking, and moving towards a dictatorship, moving towards an invasion in Venezuela, and is going to launch and is launching frontal attacks on the American working class. So our next speaker at this presentation is going to be George Wright, and he's a former retired professor at Chico State and Skyline College. Welcome, George Wright, and he's on the steering committee of UPWA.
What I'd like to comment on is hopefully to segue with what Steve just talked about. And the theme of my topic is the state of things and the working class. The premise of my presentation is that under the regime of neoliberal monopoly financialization since the 1970s, we've had a very overt class warfare by the ruling class and its political establishment, both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. But in the last few years, and certainly in the last few months, what we've seen is the beginnings of an awakening, if you will, of the working class on a global level. And what we've seen is the re-establishment or reassertion of class warfare in many parts of the world, in France, in Germany, and in the United States, Mexico, and elsewhere. Now, I'm not arguing that what we're seeing is the beginnings of socialist revolution or some insurrection, but what it does appear to be, to me, is the beginnings of a response or reaction to neoliberal monopoly capitalism and the political establishments that have been the instruments for putting these policies into place. The next point I want to make is that from my vantage point, what we're experiencing as humanity is living within the context of a great transformation. We're living through, this transformation is a significant transition to something different than how the world has functioned for the last couple hundred years, and certainly in the last 40 years under neoliberalism. I'd like to quote and have allegiance to what Antonio Gramsci wrote in his prison notebooks back in the 1920s. The crisis that we're experiencing consists of precisely in the fact that the old order is dying and the new one cannot be born yet. In the interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. And I think that's what we can characterize this particular period. Now, this transition is heading towards one of three possibilities. And this is to paraphrase Rosa Luxemburg. She said that the future was either socialism or barbarism. I personally think that we're living within the context of barbarism at this point. But I want to add a third possibility here, and it's the very morbid possibility, and that we could be possibly moving towards extinction as well. And this could take place in the two forms. One, either in an inter-imperial war that would lead to a nuclear war, or an environmental catastrophe that capitalism has been responsible for creating over the last, since the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. The other addition I want to say at this point, there are many people in this country that think they see the problems, they see the crises, but they tend to just put the responsibility on Trump as the cause of these problems. I want to differ strongly with that position. I don't see Trump as the cause of these problems. I see him as a product of the crises that I'd like to talk about that's created the state of things or the conditions we live under now. I will give him a little bit of credit that he's speeding up this crisis quite dramatically. More on that later. Now, when we look at the transition that we're experiencing, I think this is brought about because of three general elements or processes. The first major process would be the crisis of capitalism. And at the core of this crisis is the problem of capital accumulation. That dominant capital is incredibly thirsty for profit and accumulation of capital. I kind of liken that to an experience or something I saw in a movie that the Beatles did back in the 1960s called The Yellow Submarine. The scene was under the water. There were tons of fish swimming around. And there was one particular fish that had a vacuum cleaner for a nose. And the fish went around sucking up all the other fish. And then without any fish left, the fish sucked up all the water. And all that was left was the fish himself. And he turned on the back of his tail and sucked himself up. It seems to me that's a metaphor of how capitalism it functions and the direction it is going. Some of the methods that it's trying to use to accumulate as much wealth that it can is through speculation, neoliberal policies based on privatization, cutting taxes for the wealthy, and deregulation, and also imperialist drive for territorial acquisition is the method that the ruling class is trying to use at this point to address the crisis of capital accumulation. But in that process, it creates another crisis, and that is the crisis of imperialism. Again, in the drive by the imperialist countries for territorial acquisition, what they're doing, what that is about, is finding new territories so that they can exploit the labor force and natural resources in those particular areas. This crisis of imperialism on a structural level is brought to us by a relative decline of U.S. hegemony worldwide, and simultaneously the ascendancy of competitors, imperial competitors, which move into being rivals and potentially opponents in a warfare mode. This situation is somewhat similar to the realities of Britain in the 19th century, meaning its control of the world during the most of the 19th century under the rubric of Pax Britannica. But starting in the 1880s, we see the rise of competitors and eventual rivals, Germany, Japan, and the United States, et cetera, to Pax Britannica, which led to some 65 years of economic crises, as well as 2 major world wars that were devastating. The third major crisis that is the component to this transitional stage that we're living through is the crisis of climate catastrophe, which is evident around us almost every single day. If you were in the Midwest last week, a so-called polar vortex occurred, creating an incredibly freezing temperatures and wind chills that were literally unbearable for people to function in. But this climate catastrophe is manifested in all kinds of things, droughts to tsunamis, hurricanes, extreme weather patterns all the time. Now, what is very important here is that this climate change or climate catastrophe that we're living through is brought about because of the drive for profit or capital accumulation, starting at least with the rise of industrialization in the 18th century. Now, the manifestations of these 3 separate but interrelated crises that exist today, some that stand out in my mind is one, extreme inequality in the system, inequality that we can note on local levels, regional levels, national levels, and obviously on a global level as well. Now, the wealth that is at the very top has enormous political power to buy politicians and to define the political agendas, which, as we've stated before, currently are defined by neoliberal approaches and increased militarism, leading to ongoing permanent war. A second manifestation is the global integration of the production processes, which we know as globalization. Much of this is driven by the pursuit of finding the lowest wage bill possible throughout the world and the constant privatization of social services in major countries, capitalist countries throughout the world. And the third manifestation is the rise of, as I said before, class warfare by the dominant capitalist class and its state apparatus. That leads me to comment on a notion that is false, and that is that most people think that the state or the government is neutral, and that is fair if you only elect the right party or the right individuals. The state is a capitalist institution aimed to facilitate the capital accumulation process. There's a fourth manifestation as well that I see, and this is very important for the direction I'm going in, to talk about the state of the working class today, not only in the United States, but globally. And that is under the hegemony of neoliberalism, we've seen the absolute destruction of the social fabric of societies. On a number of levels, two stand out to me. One is social and interpersonal relationships and contacts have become more based on market exchanges rather than human condition and human contact. This is something that Henry Giroux writes about very prolifically and is an area that needs to be explored. The area that I'm most concerned about here is the results of this situation is the political disorientation of the majority of the population, which I think is manufactured. It is the root cause of the alleged political polarization that we have in our country and perhaps in other societies as well. And this political disorientation, I think, is manifested in three different areas or three different social components. One would be the alleged right wing and their worldview, which consists of an authoritarian, even neo-fascist direction. They're strongly nativist, meaning anti-immigration, particularly immigration of non-English speaking and non-white populations. Their worldview is very racialized as well. And they claim to be anti-statist, meaning against big government, but they strongly support increased police state apparatus as well as monies for the Defense Department to carry out a permanent war. They're not opposed to state repression as well. The second component that I argue is totally disoriented to the realities of politics today would be the libertarian perspective, which is fairly influential in many circles, political and social circles in our society. The libertarians, I believe, want their cake and eat it too, meaning they're pretty good on civil liberties. They're pretty good on opposition to military interventions, but they're horrible on the role of the government in providing social services and social protections for individuals. And so they believe in extreme limited government. Again, they're very prominent. There's a television cable network, RT, that has a show that I watch quite regularly, and that's Crosstalk with Peter Lavelle. He's very, very, very good on geopolitics, but horrific when they talk about domestic politics. And I would say that he's coming from a libertarian point of view. The third group in this triad of disorientation would be the alleged left. And I think this is going to allow us, talking about this will allow us to make a transition in talking about the nature of the working class today. I'm referring to an article written by a fellow named Jim Kavanaugh, and the title of the article is "For What It's Worth, the Yellow Vest and the Left." This was recently published in Counterpoint, on Counterpoint's website. And at the beginnings of his article, he's talking about how the American left has almost completely ignored and has dismissed the Yellow Vest movement that is going on in France at this point. To make his case, Kavanaugh argues that throughout most of history, at least modern history, the definition of the left, or a left, has been characterized by solidarity with the working class, and from his definition, and I wholeheartedly agree with him, the working class includes the majority of people in any given society of all races and all genders. And we'll add, based on contemporary views, also sexual orientation. But he proposes that, and I agree strongly with what he's saying, that the definition of the left has been redefined under the rubric of identity politics to a point where class is totally dismissed in any understanding or analysis of politics on a local or international level. Kavanaugh tells us that this new definition has been brought to us by the American Western college-educated liberals and so-called progressives, as well as some advocates of socialism, and even some who claim that they are Marxists. And therefore, instead of class solidarity that the traditional left promoted and carried out in solidarity with the working class or working classes, this new pattern of solidarity has been defined by if you're the correct race or the correct gender, or what's your race or gender politics. And so, not by accident, movements that are occurring on by working class people around the world are being ignored by this so-called identity politics left. The particular article that Kavanaugh is writing about is how that perspective is not how they interpret what's going on in France. But I think we can look at this in a much broader level. Now, what I hope we can kind of make a segue to make some comments about the crisis today that I've just described in general, and where the working classes are in relationship to this crisis. From my vantage point, what I see happening is it's hard to exactly characterize it. Is it a new, is it a revived, we'll say a reemergence of class struggle on not just a national level, but also on a global or international level, excuse me, as well. How we view this is just by looking at events that are happening around the globe. Within the last year or two, what we've seen is an acceleration of protests, demonstrations, strikes, agitation by the working class or working classes in these respective countries. There are numerous examples of these expressions. Recently, the LA teachers organized a strike, although the results were not favorable to their interests, but the language being used and some of the mobilization was very positive. The Oakland teachers are in California, are set to go out on strike very soon. There have been strikes of teachers in Berlin in the last week or so. In the last month, there have been auto workers at an Audi plant in Hungary that went out on strike for some 13 days. Teachers in so-called red states in Oklahoma and West Virginia and Arizona went out on strike last year. But we're also seeing even bigger actions, and one that is not reported in the media in our country at all is the events in Matamoros, Mexico, where in the last 3 or 4 weeks, some 70,000 workers, perhaps the largest number of workers that have gone on strike in world history, have been carrying out wildcat strikes demanding increased wages, a 20% increase in their wages, bonuses, and better working conditions. And also, we've seen in France in the last month, since November, I think some 10 or 11 straight weekends in a row, we've seen large numbers of working class people going out in protest in cities all over France under the heading of the Gilets jaunes, or the Yellow Vest movement. Also in Detroit, in the last few weeks, General Motors has called for closing some 5 plants, and we're seeing the mobilization of GM workers in protests to these plant closings. In fact, on Friday, February 8th, is supposed to be a massive demonstration at General Motors' plant in Detroit. And I would also add to this the actions of the flight controllers in response to the government shutdown. It seems to me when the TSA workers went on sick leave and the flight controllers went on sick leave and said they were going to stage a walkout, what we see is the immediate ending of that government shutdown, which gave us a taste of the power that workers have. Now, to kind of speed this up and move towards some kind of conclusion, what I see in all of these protests are a number of discernible tendencies or themes that are running through all of these manifestations, which is a term that French use for strikes and protests. I think, one, you're seeing an increased recognition on the part of workers that the union bureaucrats are collaborators with management and the owners, and that they recognize that the union bureaucrats are not working in the interests of the rank and file, but instead are miseducating them about what's going on related to politics, as well as preventing them from direct action in calling for the demands that they make. I think, secondly, another pattern is seeing is that the rank and file of workers are increasingly beginning to carry out independent action, ignoring or circumventing union bureaucrats, meaning a recognition that the only way to advance the workers' interests is through individual actions. I think the third observation that stands out, if you kind of synthesize all of these demonstrations, strikes, or protests, is that the demands are not just about bread and butter issues, but they also include demands for social justice, anti-military intervention, environmental responding to the climate, demands for to respond to the climate crisis, etc. I think a fourth tendency we see is increasingly workers are viewing the production process as not exclusively a nationalist project, but instead is an international project, which also implies that these workers are increasingly making calls for solidarity with workers on an international scale. We clearly see that related to the workers in Matamoros in Mexico and the GM workers in Detroit. So to kind of wrap that point up, we're seeing an increasing awareness of the need for solidarity on an international level. Now, this is rather logical because capital is international, therefore the working class should respond accordingly. And I think the fifth and the last pattern that I discern from what's happening is that workers are increasingly beginning to see clearly the contradictions and the connections within an integrated, globalized world capitalist system. For example, in this country, and in Mexico, in this country, we've seen calls by Republican politicians for boycotting Mexican cars, for example. Well, there's no such thing as a Mexican car. To quote Jim Kavanaugh, quote, "A modern vehicle is made up of 30,000 parts produced and assembled by workers in dozens of countries, not to mention workers who mine the process the materials from around the world." So it's logical that workers see themselves as part of a globalized working class rather than on a national basis. Now, the leadership of unions, as well as the political parties, are committed to framing the world's crises in terms of nationalism rather than an international perspective. And there's therefore enormous potential for warfare within the rank and file versus the union leadership on that particular issue. In conclusion, what we must say is that what we're witnessing at this moment is not a revolution. It is not the immediate step into a socialist world order, but it certainly appears to be something that is incredibly new to politics from the last 40 years, at least since the 1960s. But we also, and it also kind of re-establishes the legitimacy or the recognition of the political correctness, if you will, of Marx, who saw that he saw two key points here. One, that capitalism contains the seeds of its own destruction, which I think is what is rooted in the crises that we described, and that the agent for change into socialism is the international working class. Nevertheless, we must recognize that the ruling class, international ruling class, and its political establishments are going to do all in its power to confront this fledgling movement and expression using every device at its command. Thank you very much.
It is interesting tonight on the State of the Union speech of President Trump that he is calling for an attack on Venezuela, for an invasion on Venezuela to bring democracy to Venezuela. And we know the United States has a long history of bringing democracy to countries around the world, you know, and this is the history of U.S. imperialism. But one of the other interesting things that he said tonight is, here in the United States, we are alarmed by new calls to adopt socialism in our country. America was founded on liberty and independence, not government coercion, domination, and control. We are born free and we will stay free. And it obviously is the case that the capitalist class is worried about socialism. In fact, the Council of Economic Advisors, for the first time in the history of the United States, or for the first time in the history of this organization, has written a 71-page document attacking socialism. So why would the capitalist class be spending time attacking socialism? Well, the latest percentage of young people, millennium, is that more than 50% believe in socialism. They believe socialism is the solution to their crisis. So there's a radical change going on in this country, and this is why the question of workers' power and workers' struggle in the general strike is so relevant, because general strikes are a vehicle for workers challenging the capitalist class, creating dual power, and actually confronting world capitalism. And there's no greatest need in the battle to defend the working class of the world than to basically destroy and smash imperialism. And 1898, the United States invaded Cuba, they invaded Puerto Rico, they invaded the Philippines to bring democracy to this country. And we continue to control Puerto Rico as a colony. So our next speaker, Ricardo Ortiz, is going to speak about the lessons of general strikes and the working class movement in Puerto Rico, because it is our responsibility in the United States to defend the people of Puerto Rico, to fight for their independence, and to fight against U.S. imperialist control of Puerto Rico. Welcome.
One of the most important components of capitalism is obviously its imperialist phase, which is the extension of capitalism in a broad sense by these centers of capitalism, be called the imperialist countries, you know, that they do conquer the world through extracting natural resources through monopoly, capital of finance, industry, and through cartels of industry that definitely they do distribute the world, and they do compete among these centers of monopoly capitalism. Call it today, more contemporary definitions would be the European Union, the United States, and Japan. And definitely there are some, the American political scientist Immanuel Wallerstein might call them semi-peripheral countries, such as, you know, probably Saudi Arabia and etc., that are kind of major actors allied with major imperialist, these imperialist powers. And one aspect that is crucial for these imperialist powers to exercise dominion of the colonial or semi-colonial regions are the support of the trade union bureaucracy of their own imperialist powers. In the case of the United States, which concerns us the most, obviously that role is represented by the AFL-CIO, or as we call it in Latin American, the FLCIA, that you know, obviously plays a big role in the foreign policy of this country, you know, supporting anti-communist movements in Latin America and even in Europe, particularly after the Second World War, when there were so many worker uprisings in Italy, France. You know, it's documented with evidence for history that the American Central Intelligence Agency diverted funds to these democratic Christian parties, in particularly in Italy, and created these, labor, help create pro-capitalist labor unions in Europe, and definitely also in Latin America. In the case of Puerto Rico, we have an extensive history of general strikes. I mean, one of the main first experiences of big transcendence was a general strike in 1934. And it was a period of a couple years of so many strikes at one point, like in the year 1935, that, you could probably say that there were many general strikes during that period. In 1934, it was a general strike in the sugar cane refineries on the island that paralyzed and put to a standstill the country. Although ultimately, it had mixed results, and it was the betrayal of pro-imperialist trade union bureaucracy at that time, called the Federación Libre de Trabajadores. But pretty close to that, there was a general strike that paralyzed the island because, in the ports of the country, It was the 1938 port strike that, also received support from the United States Congress of Industrials organizations and practically was able to achieve a lot of victories for the workers at that point. I will certainly fast forward toward a little bit of history in the period of the late 60s toward the 90s that I actually participated in a few general strikes that took place in the country. After the war, the period of the Second World War, the American AFL-CIO make a big wave of organizing in Puerto Rico because Puerto Rico became like it became the first center in the world of large concentrations of maquilas, free trade zone that with a lot of investments in textiles and other American enterprises. And the American Federation of Labor, Congress of Industrial Organizations, FL-CIO, made a big drive to organize there and to definitely combat communist influence, because the first Confederation of Workers that had a Marxist declared component took place in the 30s, particularly in 1934, with the creation of the Confederación General de los Trabajadores, which was dominated by the Puerto Rican Communist Party. So during the 50s, the FL-CIO was able to help the American capital to displace radicalism from, the labor movement. It didn't eradicate it completely, but certainly it posed a big challenge to it. And at the same time, the United States government was cracking down on opponents of the colonial regime. The massacre of against an imprisonment of the nationalists in the 50s, in the 30s, and definitely blacklisting all the way up to the 60s, which a new wave of radicalization was able to beat back all this repressive period, particularly with the influence of the Cuban Revolution, and that inspired in 1959 the creation of the Movimiento Pro Independencia, the MPI, which was some sort of a 26 July coalition, and also came with the idea and the intent of creating what they call a new trade union movement, nuevo sindicalismo, which was going to compete with the FL-CIO, exposing the FL-CIO as a corrupt, collaborateur movement that was sponsoring definitely capitalism and imperialist competition in Puerto Rico. In 1969, many leftist forces were able to organize a coalition of different trade unions called Movimiento Obrero Unido, the United Workers Movement, that particularly was able to make a coalition of unions in the public sector, independent. The leadership was from the left, particularly from the MPI and from the old Stalinist, although in decay, Communist Party. And that was instrumental because in the early 70s, the MPI became the Puerto Rican Socialist Party, more or less inspired by the Cuban Revolution and the old Latin American new left movements. And definitely they were able to conquer a lot of the trade unions that were, emerging. In the period of 1972 to 1973, particularly, Puerto Rico, particularly in the year 1973, lived in a state of general strike. I was in 6th grade in 1973, and there was a strike going on in the Water Resources Authority, another strike in the state-owned Public Energy Authority Corporation, The firemen were on strike. In Puerto Rico, the whole fire department system is one unit. It's, the whole country is not like in the United States, which is like a local fire departments. So there were nobody that could, put down fires if there was a fire in the country. Also, the University of Puerto Rico workers were on strike. The students were on strike, demanding academic freedom and all the things that people were demanding on the 60s. And actually, there was a legacy that the youth have fought fiercely against recruitment of Puerto Ricans in the Vietnam War. Significantly, and I'm very thankful to George, I can pronounce his name, Casficas, that is a professor that authored a book of 1968, The Global Imagination and Movements, and he also wrote a couple of books on Asian labor movements. He writes about, he writes a little bit about, the opposition of the Puerto Rican youth to the Vietnam War, and actually it was even higher, the refusal that in the continental U.S. And actually, when the United States attempted to bring to court Puerto Ricans that were resisting the draft, they could not find one guilty. There are if anybody is watching this can refer themselves to the case United States versus Feliciano Grafals, where one Puerto Rican activist was sentenced to 1 hour imprisonment in the office of United States Judge Cancio, and also the case of Sixto Albelo, which couldn't be indicted because of the opposition to the war. So nobody was convicted in Puerto Rico. You can check these facts for refusing the draft because of the opposition. So going back to where I left, all these strikes were led by leftist forces, and they did prevail, organizing, in the teachers, the firemen, the Water Resources Authority, even though that the Puerto Rican government called the Army National Guard to combat these workers. They did not prevail. The workers did prevail. So it did emerge a leadership that was identified with socialism, that it was identified with radical ideas in the labor movement. So, through the decade of the 70s, it was a decade that, we can call it a golden era of the Puerto Rican labor movement. But obviously, this started to change because a lot of these leaders that now became labor leaders, they became bureaucratized, they started making good money, they started getting good contracts, and then, more or less of their militancy, started to change. Because, life, for the reformists, life changed. So when the 80s come in scene to the world, we know that it's the era of neoliberalism. Margaret, the main exponents of economic and political neoliberalism in the United States, obviously, is Ronald Reagan, and in the United Kingdom, is Margaret Thatcher that came with this wave that everything could be done by the private sector. The state should be out of economic decisions. So obviously that impacted the whole world, and that obviously was going to impact Puerto Rico because it's a colony of the United States. So finally, in the early 90s, they came to the government of Puerto Rico because of pressures of the international capitalist monopoly system, attempted to privatize the Public Telephone Corporation. Definitely this created a reaction to fight back against this interest of privatization. So in a country that, there has been so many general strikes from 1 day, from 2 days, from months, from weeks, you have a historical experience. So now I am in college, and we also, I went to the University of Puerto Rico, which is a public university system. And we ourselves have been in strikes, and we were going to face also with the situation that the government wanted to raise our tuition hikes. So immediately, this call for solidarity for the telephone workers received a good echo in the minds of the rest of the working class. So it was created what it was called the COS, in Spanish is Comité de Organizaciones Sindicales, which is an organizing trade union committee, which try to bring together all these trade unions, even the FL-CIO and the independent unions. I must say that since the 70s, the FL-CIO lost a lot of ground on the island. They were discredited, but still they had a presence. So definitely, in order to make a general strike, you have to prepare the population, and you got to prepare, the workers themselves. So immediately, they were created throughout the country what they were called regional trade union committees, which were all over the island. These regional committees, they were like more or less some sort of Soviets. People from trade unions will come and meet and plan for the general strike. Not only, the people that the Workers' Committee had a leadership that was selected among the representatives of the trade unions and the working class, but also there were students, there were workers that were not in unions, and definitely, a strategy was planned, discussed, theory was also, debated and all these things. But anyways, the people that were in charge were the bureaucrats that ran the union, the trade union that were in the long distance division of the Public Telephone Corporation. And obviously that has a limit, because the labor bureaucracy always doesn't, wherever it is, do not want things to get out of hand. And they want to always make a pact if they could, and effectively, that's what they started to do. It was decided that we should have gone on general strike for a few days, but then, they start coming with the idea, well, let's do a series of demonstrations, strikes, and let's see what happens. Obviously, this, took place. A whole bunch of a series of informational pickets, some work stoppages in the country for a few hours, until finally, the labor bureaucrats decided to go on general strike. But they were forced to it, and the leadership of this, trade union, which belonged to an organization called the Central Puertorriqueña de Trabajadores, which was, and it is, affiliated with the International Socialist Organization, talking about the Socialist International, I must say, which is based in London. They are the descendants of the Second International, the International Social Democracy. So, finally they did agree, and the country went on general strike, but, obviously they made a pact. So what the bureaucrats pacted was to keep the jobs, but the long-distance service of the public corporation was sold to the Spanish Telefónica ESA, which is an Spanish multinational company. So what are the lessons, and that was my first actual experience with a general strike as such. I had been in student strikes and so on, but that was my first experience at that time with a general strike. What are the experiences, and what are the lessons of the general strike? Number one, the labor bureaucrats always, they are pro-capitalism. The FL-CIO is pro-capitalism, the French Trade Union Federation is pro-capitalism. So they want to, when they're forced, they are forced to bargain for benefits for their membership. But at the same time, they do support the system that they live in, and that's capitalism. You know, so obviously they do think that they keeping the status quo is good, you know. So in the imperialist countries, definitely they will support the foreign policy of their country at the behest of their multinational corporations. So, but there is some actors that come to place to support also, and historically have done that in the cases of upheavals. They are the following: the Social Democrats, obviously, which you know, they call themselves socialists, but they, since the split in 1914 between the Bolshevik, between you know, the so-called socialists that supported the World War I, they supported their own bourgeoisies in the First World War, versus the people that split it and created the Third International. They have always supported capitalism and imperialism. So the social, and to this day, they do the same thing. They do support, you know, capitalism, and each day, this epoch of capitalist decay, they are more and less relevant and they are more reformist than always. But there are also another type of reformists, collaborators, that Leon Trotsky called them the middle caste. And that's a variant called the Stalinist. The Stalinists, they do believe in their Popular Front, which is, you know, bringing their parties to capitalist governments and occupy ministries, and you know, because they believe that there is a democratic stage that they have, you know, that in order to achieve socialism, they have to go. And the experiences of the, you know, Spanish Popular Front, where, you know, the Popular Front government, the self-crushed rebellions in Asturias, they denied the independence of Morocco because they were a capitalist government. The same thing after World War II. The French Communist Party in 1947 went in a coalition with de Gaulle to be expelled out of government. And then, you know, in 1968, they were instrumental. They were instrumental in derailing, at that time, the largest general strike on the history of humanity at that time. 22% of the population of France went on strike. It was so dangerous for the capitalist class that de Gaulle flew to Germany to a French base called in Baden-Baden. And he spoke with one of the French generals there. He went back to France, and you know, he canceled because the French Constitution allowed him to do so. He suspended the National Assembly. He made a speech on television where he made clear that he was not disregarding military the use of military force in the general strike, and called elections. And actually, people don't know, but you know, he won the elections, and he even increased the membership of you know, his party in power. And that was thanks to the Stalinists, that they made the historic pact that they agreed to call off the strike. And, you know, that's the role they're playing. And, you know, in recent history, there's a new variant that the Stalinists play. And I give you an example because it's something going on in Latin America that you know, obviously all the Stalinists and some other parties that call themselves supposedly Trotskyists or more to the left are Stalinists have supported. I give you an example. The so-called Venezuelan Bolivarian Revolution. You know, the so-called Bolivarian Revolution never ended and never pretended to end capitalist dominion in Venezuela. It did not go all the way to confiscate all private property. Even Chavez, at one point, he sincerely said, you know, this Bolivarian socialism is not like Cuba. He made it clear, you know. So, but the Stalinists were talking about socialism of the 21st century, you know, instead of criticizing Chavez and the Bolivarians from the left and encouraging the masses of Venezuelans to go all the way and establish a dictatorship of the proletariat, they were, praising the so-called Bolivarian Revolution. A lot of these studies ignorance, they ignore, as for example, that a lot of the nationalizations, limited nationalizations that the Venezuelan Bolivarian revolution did was because of mass protests. As for example, in a multinational complex called Sidor, that is a cement corporation, it was nationalized because the union in that corporation started doing strikes demanding the government to nationalize it. And finally they did. And actually those workers spent time in jail by the same Bolivarian government. So, these are ways that, these so-called allies from the left collaborate to derail revolutionary process. It's no way that you can make a revolution halfway. Either you go all the way confiscating capitalist property and establish a workers' rule and a worker state, or the capitalists simply are going to come back. They did it in Chile in '73. They did it, in the Popular Fronts in the 30s, and actually even paved the way for Hitler to come to power, because the Stalinists also, at times called the Social Democrats social fascists. So they called not to do united front with them from time to time. It's either going into government with the so-called nationalists and progressive forces and enforce and administer capitalism through ministries, or abstain in a sectarian way through the so-called third period politics, like they did in, before 1934. And sometimes they do it, particularly, the Maoist variant of so-called Marxism. So, we have opponents in the workers' movement, and we have to develop a new strategy, go back to the real strategies, which is, the creating of workers' parties. The general strike has its limits. The general strike, as it was described by the Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky, it can lead to an insurrection, but it has a limit too. If it doesn't have a party that can guide the working class and create its own militia, the system is not going to be overthrown. Capitalism still will be there. We are living in an epoch of inter-imperialist fierce competition. All these expressions of Emmanuel Macron about, France has to develop its own military independent from the United States, and I'm going to quote his words, because probably France might have to go to war against the US or China or Russia. It is because France is a fierce, it's an imperialist country. It's less powerful than the United States. But definitely, if you go and watch French investment in the continent of Africa, you see that a lot of, the mining resources, water resources, oil are owned by French multinational corporations. If you follow the international economy and inter-imperialist rivalries, as for example, you will notice that since 1970, France has intervened militarily more than 40 times in the continent of Africa at the behest of Total, of the French Mining Corporation, and so others, in Mali, in Chad, in Libya. Actually, people say that, criticize the United States intervention in Libya, and it should be criticized because it was a murderous intervention. But I got to inform you one thing. The biggest number of airstrikes was not done by the United States Air Force, let me tell you. It was done by the French Air Force. They did more air missions than even the United States Air Force. And actually, it was because the main investor, the main predator in Libya were Total and other French and European corporations such as Repsol, like I said, Total, and other multinationals from European origin. So if we look at the statistics today, we'll see that the United States is losing hegemony, it's facing fierce competition. The United States remains the main and principal imperialist predator. But if we look now at a multinational production and the obtain of surplus value, you will see that the United States has lost a lot of ground versus the Chinese. Now the largest banks in the world are no longer Americans. If you look at any list by The Economist, Business Insider, whoever, whichever capitalist publication, you will see that the first bank on the list is Chinese. And if you look at the first 10 transnational banks, there are only now 2 from American origin. If you look, and I challenge people that are watching this to watch about now who are the major car manufacturers, you will see that that reign and dominion has fallen under the rock of the United States. Now it is Toyota, it's Volkswagen, and even the French auto manufacturer. So the United States now are among the first 5, but they are not the first 3 like they were until 20 years ago. Somebody, somebody was speaking about there are no American cars, but definitely, that there are Mexican cars. When Trump was saying that he was going to put tariffs and taxes on cars manufactured in Mexico, it was a fantasy. He couldn't do that. He had to say that to satisfy the racist base. Because why? Because if he would have done that, he would have ruined his American manufacturing production. I mean, the Europeans would have beat him even more. So he started saying these promises that he was not going to keep. And he didn't keep. It was impossible because the American imperialist manufacturers, they need less taxes abroad. They cannot. If they would have taxed these cars coming into the United States, it would be definitely harmful for the American imperialist manufacturer makers. So, still I got some time. In terms of weather catastrophes and so on, we in Puerto Rico definitely face one of the major disasters in disaster capitalism. Hurricane Maria destroyed the country, and President Trump responded with a trip over there to throw paper tower at the people, making fun of the people. And that's, like the big example of disaster capitalist. Academy, that used to be Blackwater in the past, went over there to get contracts to do security, supposedly security. There was this group of fraudulent, almost non-existent corporation called Whitefish that were, going to get multi-millionaire contracts. And they were only, it was a ghost company. There were only 3 employees, and they were going to get millions of dollars to do supposedly work. They were denounced so vigorously that they definitely had, the government of Puerto Rico had to partially rescind the contract. I just want to end saying this. The great revolutionary Rosa Luxemburg said, it is socialism or barbarism, and it's no other way around that. I don't want to sound cliquish, but the only way we're going to end this capitalist barbarism is if we definitely build communist parties, workers' parties, that organizes with its own armed wing that organizes the working class using general strikes, demonstrations. Strikes. Actually, there are political general strikes. I give you an example. In the 90s, 2000s, the people of Puerto Rico were fighting to expel the criminal American Navy out of the municipality island of Vieques, which the American military had a training bombing ground over there. So one of the actions that took place was a general strike. You know, that more than 500,000 people demonstrated against the naval presence on the island. And definitely, I want to say that in 1998, there was another general strike. I did participate in one day of the general strike because I was living in here in San Francisco. So I flew to the island. For 1 day? For 1 day. The general strike lasted 2 days. You know, and I was able to catch 1 day of the general strike, and that was against privatization. And unfortunately, by then, the FL-CIO was instrumental in helping derailing the militancy of the workers down there. And 2 years after the general strike, the president of a bank in Puerto Rico, with the FL-CIO president, Jose Rodriguez Baez, which was an Stalinist in the 70s, and still he says that he is a socialist. He was the chief of the local FL-CIO. They organized what it was called a social contract conference with bankers, you know, to discuss the labor future in Puerto Rico. So I just want to say that, yes, the general strike could be used as a political weapon and also as an economic weapon, and both to force a government and help to bring down the government. But again, if it is not accompanied by a communist party that has the right tactics, still the system will exist. But, you know, we still, I think we should push and promote forward the slogan of the working class.